Well, good to see everyone this morning. Glad you joined us, and I'm excited to be able to share with you guys a simple message, but I think a very powerful one. And the title of my teaching is A Heart That Is Never Satisfied. And I want to talk about how to cultivate kind of like a mindset, a life orientation that continually desires to seek more of God. Our main text is going to be coming from the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Mark. So if you would turn to, Gospel of Matthew. Please turn to Matthew chapter 5. So at the beginning of Matthew chapter 5, we have this list of things that Jesus says are blessings, beatitudes, because each of the statements begin with the word blessed or the blessing that's spoken over particular categories of individuals. The one that I want us to focus on is number 6 here. The one in verse 6. And that is that it says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because they will be filled." So there's a classification of individuals. It's those who hunger and thirst, and they're hungering and thirsting for righteousness. They're hungering and thirsting for the ways of God. And those individuals will be blessed. And they'll be blessed because that desire will not go unmet. But it says they will be filled. And for those who hunger and thirst, having that filling, being, you could say, satisfied, that's the blessing. But there's a paradox at work here, because being filled or being satisfied because we hunger and thirst isn't sort of like this place that we arrive at, is sort of like this state of contentment. You know, like after you eat a meal and your stomach is full, you no longer are hungry. You are satisfied. And at that point, you are done eating. You stop eating because you have no more hunger. The paradox is when it comes to God and the things of God, particularly the presence of God Himself in our lives and experiencing God, the paradox is that we are satisfied by God, but we never want to be. Like we never want to be fully satisfied, because we never want to arrive at some place of contentment in our hunger, to where our heart is sort of like placated. We're like, I have experienced enough of God. I know enough about God. I feel like I'm in a good place, and therefore I'm just going to kind of step back in my endeavor to seek God. That's what we never want to be. So we want to have a heart that is never satisfied, but God promises that He will fill us and satisfy us. So, as mature Christians, sometimes we might feel that we have walked the road long enough. We come to a place of sort of like, we feel we have a good grasp on maybe who God is. Maybe we feel like we have a grasp on how to do this thing called following Jesus, and we're at a stable place in our Christian walk. And that can be a dangerous sort of scenario, because a lot of times in life, if we get to that place where things feel kind of stable, we tend to maybe let off the pedal. We tend to sort of like decrease the effort we invest in that category of life. You know, for example, if you're tending to your yard, and let's say, you know, your yard is overgrown and you start trimming it, you cut the grass, you trim the hedges, you weed whack and edge around everything, and you get it to a place where it looks good. Well, you get to a place typically where you're like, I'm satisfied. It's good for now. And then you deviate from that task to you transition to something else. Well, when we approach God, when we think about our heart toward God, The danger is we can sometimes get there as Christians. We can sometimes become complacent, sort of settle in to where we are, to sort of our current, our current experience of God, our current degree of which we know God and are living with God in our lives. So that's why in Matthew chapter 5 here in verse 6, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness because they will be filled. This filling is actually not a static kind of like achievement. There's a lot of parallelisms here with what Jesus is saying and some of the experience of the Israelites during the Exodus time. If you guys are familiar with the Exodus of Israel from Egypt, if not, you can read about that back in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. But when they leave Egypt, and God brings the children of Israel out into the desert, into the wilderness, over around Mount Sinai, and they form a covenant with God, the Sinaitic covenant, where God gives the people of Israel the law that He has, His laws, the commandments through Moses, the leader of the Israelites. And that's where we come up with the term law of Moses. It's the law that comes through Moses from God. The Israelites they had physical hunger and thirst, and they're out in the wilderness, and it's a barren land. It's not like a desert like we think of that has a whole bunch of like sand dunes and things like that. It's just sort of like away from cultivated, civilized land, and in that area of the world, it's pretty sparse. It is dry and arid, and there are just bushes everywhere and things like that. But there's not a lot of living animals. There's not a lot of water sources. So traveling in that vicinity, hunger and thirst would be a natural physical response of the Israelites. Well, what does God do? They grumble and murmur and complain. And so God says that He's going to feed them flesh in the evenings and then manna in the morning, and that they will be filled, God said. But when He did this, it wasn't that they were going to be able to accumulate this storehouse of food and then be able to sit back and relax. No, what God had was every day a provision for them to be filled. But they had to go and retrieve the manna. They had to go collect the manna every morning and then be satisfied or filled with that. But they couldn't keep any till the following day, unless it was the day before the Sabbath. But every day they would return to the wilderness, to the land, and see new manna that they would collect and then be filled or satisfied by that. That's kind of the idea here with Jesus. As He's saying, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because they will be filled. Part of this paradox is that being filled by God, which this idea of being filled is sort of like God is going to feed that hunger and thirst, which is a metaphor for kind of like desiring God's goodness, desiring God's ways, seeking after God, wanting to experience God. It actually is sort of like this positive feedback loop where when you receive filling, satisfaction because of your hunger and thirst, and God fills you and satisfies you with Himself, that then spurns additional hunger and thirst, by which God then fills and satisfies you again. And the feedback loop continues in a positive cycle, drawing you nearer and closer to God's heart and experiencing more of God in your life. Now, we all know that too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. There's a Proverbs actually talks about this in regard to, for example, honey. Now in Proverbs 25:16, did you find some honey? Eat just enough for you, so that you do not have too much of it and then vomit it up. Too much of a good thing, even if it's delicious honey, is bad. It causes stomach ache and you'll end up throwing up. This can be applicable to all kinds of other things besides just the substance of honey. Too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. We're supposed to enjoy all things in moderation, except when it comes to God. Even the sweet and pleasurable and good taste of honey can turn against us and cause us to become sick, cause us to repulse that good substance. But there's never a point at which seeking God and thirsting for God and hungering for God that ever will return back to us a negative experience. There's never a time where God is going to deny us in our pursuit of Him. In the previous chapter, in chapter 24 of Proverbs, in verse 13, it says, "My son, eat some honey, for it is good, and honey from the comb is sweet in your mouth. Likewise, know that wisdom is sweet to your soul." Part of the idea of wisdom in the book of Proverbs is living in a relationship with God, recognizing that we are supposed to submit to His rule and authority as the rightful king of the cosmos and the creator of all things. And so, like honey is good, and it's sort of like allows us to have this sensation of pleasure and enjoyment. Wisdom, knowing God, living with the fear of Yahweh, which is to revere Him and to submit to His authority and His law and do the things that are pleasing in His sight, that is sweet to our soul. That is satisfying to our soul. But like honey, there's no end. Honey, there's too much. There can be a place where you've consumed too much, but there's no point at which you have too much wisdom. Part of the book of Proverbs states that the wise know that they need more wisdom. And therefore, as Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 5, I think people who really are filled and satisfied by God, they know that they actually need more of God. They know that they're not at some end part of their journey with God and have come to this sort of top of the end of the rope, top of the line, or end of the line journey, but that hungering and thirsting for God and then being filled by God then prompts to understand there's still more. There's more of God to be experienced. There's more of God's heart to come to know. There's more of life to be lived with God. In the Old Testament, David is a great example of an individual who sought God, had experiences with God, and realized that he needed more. Realized that even being filled by God to the point that David did, which he had amazing experiences with God and was called a man after God's own heart, that he recognized and expressed in very vivid detail sort of this heart that longs for God with like what I would say is an unsatiable thirst, an unquenchable thirst. Probably one of the best places to see this is in Psalm 63, which is a fantastic psalm expressing this deep yearning, this deep longing that David had for God. And in Psalm 63, verse 1, it says, "O God, you are my God. I will earnestly seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh, my body yearns for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Yes, I have seen you in the sanctuary, seeing your power and your glory. For your covenant faithfulness is better than life. So my lips will praise you. Yes, I will bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul will be satisfied as with marrow and fat. My mouth will praise you with joyful lips. The famous, I'm going to stop here. The famous industrialist, John D. Rockefeller. Many of you might know this historic figure, early 20th century pioneer in the steel industry and in construction. He is the most wealthy American ever, even in modern day. His cumulative net worth is somewhere around like $435 billion in today's currency. Now, Elon Musk is approaching that. I think his current worth is like $430 billion, of which I think there's something on the horizon of where he might be able to have his net worth doubled and he may become the first trillionaire. I saw a news article on that recently. But anyway, Rockefeller, very, very wealthy individual, wealth beyond anything that a person could ever probably spend, obviously ever need. And he is famous for a certain remark that a reporter once asked him after he had risen as this giant in the industry and received all this wealth. The reporter asked Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, like, how much money is enough? And his famous reply is just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. Now, I use this both as a positive and a negative illustration. A negative illustration in the sense that he was sort of caught up in a world that is filled with greed, a world in which there's no amount of power, no amount of fame, no amount of money that would ever satisfy the human heart. The human heart in these pursuit of these vices are never, it's never fulfilled. People always want more. Now, in the positive sense, this illustration serves kind of the idea of even with all the wealth he had, if you think about it metaphorically, how much knowledge, how much of God's presence and the experience of God's Spirit in your life, if you are one of great wealth, where you have a flourishing walk with God and are enjoying this deep, intimate relationship with Him, how much of God is enough? I hope we would answer in a similar way that Rockefeller did about money. Just a little bit more. I want just a little bit more God. I don't quite have enough yet. I'm not quite fully satisfied. The heart that says, I still long for you, God. And not just in a little bit, like I could have a little, just a splash of cream in my coffee or in my tea, and then that's good. No, this is as David is crying out and saying, my soul thirsts for you, my flesh yearns for you, as though I'm walking in this dry desert place where there's no water. That we would, even if we are super rich in our spiritual life and have risen to a level of maturity that is commendable in the Christian discipleship, becoming disciples of Christ, that we would still cry, our heart would still cry out, I want more. I want more of you, God. In the world, the more you try to get, and this is sort of part of the paradox with God, is in the world, the more you try to get, I think the more empty you truly feel. You can ask a lot of famous people at the end of their life, there are a number of them who have testified And recently I heard about a interview with like Will Smith, of where here's a man in the industry of film who has essentially he's done everything. He's won everything. He there I mean he has risen to the top, and he said he still feels that he has more, there's something more he needs to do. He, Even after all of his success, something's missing. But that's the world. The world never actually gives true satisfaction. But the more of God that you get, you do feel satisfied. But it's not just a satisfaction that stays stagnant. It's a satisfaction that then produces additional desire. And it's not like additional desire where you feel anxious because you need to do more and have more, or a feeling of deprivation where like, yes, I feel satisfied with God, but I'm still young, or I'm still working on trying to follow Jesus in my life, trying to develop holiness. It's not a negative desire that is produced. It's a desire that comes with joy, to be joyful knowing what you have, but what you also want. It's a joy to know that that we should desire God more. And as we desire God more, then God will give us more. And James talks about uh, this desire that we have and the way God responds to it. Let me share my screen. We'll go back to scripture here. James 4:8. All right, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. This is that principle in action of where, as we seek God and we're drawing near to God, that God is going to draw near to us, and he's going to then reinforce our desire with increased desire. He's going to honor our initiative to seek him by then spurning us to have further desire for him. He's going to work in us to want him more. So as we want him, he will then help us and produce within us greater and greater desire for him. And as we do that, then, and as we're seeking him, then he will come nearer and nearer to us. The prophet Jeremiah made a great statement in Jeremiah 29, verse 13. He said, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart." That's all God really wants, right? He just wants all of our heart. And I think we all could admit that there are parts of our heart, there are parts of our life we probably have not yet turned over and surrendered to the Lord and allowed him to come into our life in those places and then do his work in us. But Jeremiah offers this prophecy that if we seek God, that we will find him when we seek him with all of our heart. Now, I was reading a book recently. I started a book recently. It's well, let me I don't have to show you the pic. I have a picture of it actually here. So it's called The God Chasers, and it's by Tommy Tenney. It was written back in 1998. So I'm reading this book, and I just found it on my shelf. I have a lot of books on my shelf that I've inherited and have not yet had a chance to read them. This is one of the books that I was reading at The God Chasers, and it really kind of undergirds this idea of having a heart that is never satisfied. Here is one of the quotes that I thought was very meaningful. Uh, Tenney writes, "A God chaser may be excited about some dusty truth and may even be thrilled somewhat over determining the weight of, and he quotes a Hebrew word, kavod, which just means weight or glory in Hebrew, that passed in the path and how long ago it was. But that's just the problem. How long ago was it? A true God chaser is not happy with just past truth. He must have present truth. God chasers don't want to just study from the moldy pages of what God has done. They're anxious to see what God is doing. Now, Tenney might be speaking a little bit too negatively about study of the scriptures and learning about the historic work that God has done throughout history. I think there's great value in that. But I do admit he is pointing out a really important principle, and that is we can't fixate on the past only. We can't just look at what God has done and study the past. That is very helpful. It can be extremely valuable in forming our knowledge and understanding of who God is and our trust in his reliability and his faithfulness to fulfill his promises. But it can't stop there. It has to be that we are concerned with seeking God and what he's doing now in our lives, in our world, in our day. And so his book is all about chasing God in your life and trying to experience God now. And I think that sometimes we can get so preoccupied with maybe studying the Bible and we focus so much on these words of revelation that have been given to us that we maybe don't balance it with also the present experience of seeking God in our lives today. And so that's one of the things that Tenney is sort of like trying to explain is that the church has maybe focused too much on some of the, I guess, the overemphasis on studying doctrines and scripture to the exclusion of a personal, intimate relationship in the present with God. And that's why he distinguishes this idea of past truth from present truth. But all truth is God's truth, whether you're learning about what God has done or if you're seeing what God is doing. Both are good and both are valuable. But Tenney's just saying we need to be thinking about how are we chasing God today. One more quote that I really kind of like opened my eyes and I want to share it with you guys. It's about crumbs versus bread. And what he writes is he says, there is much more of God available than we have ever known or imagined, but we have become so satisfied with where we are and what we have that we don't press in for God's best. Yes, God is moving among us and working in our lives, but we've been content to comb the carpet for crumbs, as opposed to having the abundant loaves of hot bread God has prepared for us in the ovens of heaven. Now, it's a great metaphor, the idea of the feast and the satisfaction that God has ready for us. And he's comparing it with this idea of crumbs, where people are content with the little bits of food that they've received, the bit of filling that God has given to them, that they stop there. And they don't realize that there's just this uh, incredible feast banquet that God is looking to give to us. And not just one banquet, but a repeated banquet. Think of it like the daily, it's a daily meal of unlimited proportions that is going to fill us and satisfy us. But as we then seek God, as we have that hunger and thirst return, each day we go back and we receive that bread from heaven, which comes from the Lord Jesus Christ in our life, and we get filled and satisfied by God. One of the books that has been, I think, the most meaningful in my Christian life that I read many, many years ago when I was young and I was learning to understand what it meant to really be Christian, to really sort of like have a deep and strong faith, which I didn't have at that time. It's a book by A.W. Tozer, one of my favorite authors, called The Pursuit of God. It's a classic volume on Christian literature. I highly recommend, if anybody has not read this book, to pick up a copy and at least read it one time in your life. But Tozer, I think, really nails this sort of like idea of not living with an attitude of being satisfied, but living with an attitude of, I'm not there yet. I want more. I need more. God, help me, like basically produce in me that desire for you that only you can satisfy, and to do that repeatedly. What he writes is he says, "O God, I've tasted thy goodness, and it has both satisfied me and made me thirsty for more. I am painfully conscious of my need for further grace. I'm ashamed of my lack of desire. O God, I want to want thee. I long to be filled with longing. I thirst to be made more thirsty still." All right, the remainder of the quote is, "Show me thy glory, I pray thee, so that I may know thee indeed. Begin in mercy a new work of love within me. Say to my soul, rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. Then give me grace to rise and follow thee up from this misty lowland where I have wandered so long." I don't know if any of us are in a misty lowland in our walk with the Lord, or feeling like we've hit a plateau and don't know where to go from here, just kind of feel like we've been idling by, or like holding the status quo. But as Tozer is saying, we can pray for God to ignite within us that fire for, and desire for him. And that as we sort of step toward God, he'll fill us. And we step again toward God, he'll fill us again. And we can come to learn and see that as we seek him and desire him, he produces greater desire in us for himself. And then he satisfies us with himself. And there's a famous quote from an ancient theologian, whether you like him or not, up for question, but his name is Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. He has a famous quote in his book, The Confessions, where he says that our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. And I think that's the truth, is that we need to understand that our hearts never really are at rest. And they're even not at rest when we are resting in God, because we're always seeking that greater degree, that greater depth of rest that God has for us. The Christian walk is always just a journey. This side of the resurrection, this side of the kingdom, we never really arrive. There's always a higher step to take. There's always another summit to reach in our walk with God. And as we desire him more each day, we can experience those greater degrees of God as he will draw closer to us. I want to end with one more verse from Psalm 63. Later on in Psalm 63, in verse 8, David writes, with passion, I pursue and cling to you. Because I feel your grip on my life, I keep my soul close to your heart. This is the Passion Translation. And the Hebrew here about this, like, I pursue and cling to you, the Hebrew really means to pursue after with like intent and determination. And that's really what it is to have a heart that's not satisfied, is to have a heart that pursues after God and is never satisfied with where it's at. A heart that always can enjoy the blessings from God, the satisfaction from God in that moment, but then always reaching forward to the next. And because the psalmist here is saying that he understands God's grip, or God's hold on his life, the way God works in his life, he makes sure that he keeps his soul close to Yahweh's heart. And so when we become satisfied and feel like we're kind of okay in our faith, I think we can drift. We can drift away from the heart of God without even knowing it. Because the Christian life is one of constant pursuit of the one who has called us, who has redeemed us, who's loved us before the foundation of the world, and who one day will resurrect us to be in his wonderful kingdom to come. So that's what I had to share today with you guys. Encouraging you to continue in your pursuit of God and to check and measure the status of your hunger and your desire for God, and to seek to form within yourself a heart that is never completely satisfied, but always yearning and longing for more of God. All right. God bless you guys.